I spotted my granddaughter sitting on a bench outside the hospital entrance. She had a duffel bag at her feet and a sleeping toddler pressed against her side. She wasn't crying. That was the part that scared me most. She had moved past crying. I pulled the car to the curb and stepped out before the engine finished ticking. "Grandma." Her voice was hollow. I looked at the bag. I looked at little Eli, 3 years old, his cheek smashed against her shoulder, completely unaware that his world had just been turned upside down. I looked at my granddaughter, 26 years old, still wearing her work badge from the dental office where she'd been a receptionist for 2 years. "Get in the car," I said. She opened her mouth to explain something. I held up one hand. "Get in the car, sweetheart. We'll talk when Eli is buckled." She didn't argue. That told me everything, too. I drove 3 blocks before I spoke. Eli was still asleep in the back seat, borrowed car seat clicking softly at every turn. My granddaughter stared out the passenger window at the strip mall sliding past. "Tell me," I said. She told me. Her father-in-law, I'll call him what he was, a man who had never once looked me in the eye at a family dinner, had called her into the living room of the house she shared with my grandson and his parents. My grandson was at work. The father-in-law sat in his recliner like a judge behind a bench and told her that she was not the right kind of woman for his son. He used words I won't repeat here, words about where she came from, words about her family, words that were designed to reduce a person to nothing. He told her the house was his name, the car in the driveway was his name, the job she had at the dental office his cousin owned was his arrangement. Then he told her she had 2 hours. She had called my grandson. He didn't answer. She called him 4 more times. He didn't answer. She called him 4 more times. He didn't answer. So she packed what she could carry, bundled up Eli, and sat down on that bench outside the hospital because it was the nearest public place she knew and she felt safe near the security guards at the entrance. She had not called me. I glanced over at her. "Why didn't you call me first?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She looked at her hands. "I didn't want you to think less of him," she said. She meant my grandson. I kept thinking he'd call back. I nodded slowly. I understood that. I understood the particular kind of hope that makes a person wait when they should be moving. I had lived inside that hope once, a very long time ago, and I knew exactly how it worked, and exactly how it worked and exactly how much damage it could do while you were busy waiting. "He'll call back eventually," I said, "but you don't need him to." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see she was trying to figure out what I meant. I let her wonder for a little while. We had things to do first. My name is Eleanor. I am 64 years old. I live in a house I own outright in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, and I have owned it outright for 11 years. I retired at 58 from a logistics company I built from a spare bedroom and a secondhand laptop when my own children were young. By the time I sold my majority stake, the company had contracts with 4 regional hospital networks and employed 61 people. I did not announce this at holiday dinners. I brought casseroles and asked about people's jobs and admired babies and kept my mouth shut about money because money talked loudly enough on its own when the time came. The time had come. I got my granddaughter and Eli settled in my guest room. I made grilled cheese because Eli woke up asking for it, and there is no crisis in the world that cannot be slightly softened by a grilled cheese sandwich. While she got him to sleep that night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and I made a list. My grandson's father-in-law, I'll call him Gerald because that was his name and he had forfeited any courtesy I might have extended, owned 3 rental properties in the Columbus metro area. He ran a small property management business out of an office on the east side. He had a brother-in-law who was a contractor, a nephew who did landscaping, and a cousin who owned the dental practice where my granddaughter had worked. It was a neat little circle. Everybody fed everybody. Nobody from outside the circle got very far in. My grandson had been working for Gerald's property management company for 2 years. He handled tenant communications and maintenance scheduling. He was paid a salary that kept him just dependent enough. Gerald had structured it that way. I had seen it and said nothing because my grandson was an adult and it was not my place. And because I had believed, foolishly, that Gerald's obvious fondness for his son would protect the people around his son. I had been wrong about that. I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was call in a favor from a woman named Patricia, who had been my accountant for 12 years and who now consulted for a firm that handled commercial real estate. I texted her that night, "Need eyes on some property records when you have a morning minute. Nothing urgent." Except it is. She knew what that meant. Patricia and I had a long history of urgent things we communicated in calm voices. The second thing I did was pull up the Ohio tenant-landlord statutes, because I had been on the board of a housing nonprofit for 6 years, and I knew those laws the way some people know hymns. Not perfectly, but well enough to sing along without the book. The third thing I did was nothing, because Eli had padded out of the guest room in his socks and climbed into my lap and fallen back asleep with his face against my collarbone. And I sat there in the quiet kitchen, holding him and thinking about the kind of man who looks at a young woman with a toddler and gives her 2 hours. I thought about it for a long time. 2 days later, Patricia called me back. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice had the particular texture it got when she had found something. "You want to tell me why Gerald Marsh has been filing his rental income under a business entity that dissolved in 2019? I set down my coffee cup. "Say that again." She said it again, slower, with more detail. "The dissolved LLC, the property's still generating rental income. The income that was, as far as the IRS and the state of Ohio were concerned, floating in a gray area that had likely been generating penalties for 3 years without Gerald realizing it, because Gerald, whatever else he was not a careful man with paperwork." "Is there more?" I asked. "There is more," Patricia said. "One of his rental properties has an active housing code violation from 14 months ago. Heating system. Tenant filed a complaint, inspector came out, Gerald was notified. Violation was never resolved. The tenant is still there? The tenant is still there. Probably freezing every winter and not knowing he has legal recourse." I wrote this down on my list. "Patricia," I said, "I need you to put me in touch with whoever does housing code enforcement follow-up on the East Side." She laughed, not unkindly. "I already sent you the number." That was Patricia. My grandson called my granddaughter on the 3rd day. I was in the next room and I did not eavesdrop, but I heard the shape of the conversation. The long silences on her end, the tinny voice coming through the phone that rose and fell in explanation or justification, I couldn't tell which. When she came out of the room, her face was composed in a way that was worse than tears. "He says his father didn't mean it the way it sounded," she told me. I nodded. "He says he was at a job site and his phone was in the truck." I nodded again. "He wants me to come back. He says his father won't, that it won't happen again." I looked at her for a moment. She was standing in my kitchen doorway in borrowed pajamas, 26 years old, waiting for me to tell her what to do. And I thought about all the years I'd spent becoming a woman whose granddaughter could stand in her kitchen doorway and wait for wisdom, and I thought about whether I had actually earned that or just gotten old. "What do you want?" I asked her. She was quiet for a long time. Eli banged something in the living room and she didn't flinch. "I want Eli to be safe," she said. "I want to not feel like that ever again. Like I was nothing. Like we were nothing." "Okay," I said. "Then let me show you something." I sat her down at the kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I showed her the property records. I showed her the dissolved LLC. I explained what that meant in plain language. I showed her the housing code violation. I told her about the tenant who had been living without adequate heat for over a year. She listened carefully. She was smart. She had always been smart, which was part of why Gerald had worked so hard to make her feel otherwise. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means your father-in-law has been cutting corners for a long time," I said, "and corners have a way of catching up." "But what does it mean for us?" I closed the laptop. "It means you have options. And options are the only thing that matter right now. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I was not interested in revenge for its own sake. I was 64 years old and I had watched enough people spend their energy on revenge to know that it was an expensive hobby that rarely paid what it promised. What I was interested in was leverage. Leverage was different. Leverage was quiet and patient, and it moved things without shouting. I called my attorney, a woman named Diane who had handled my business contracts for 15 years and who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness and stopped being surprised by any of it. I explained the situation. Diane listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about her. "The dissolved LLC issue is the most interesting piece," she said when I finished. "Depending on how he's been handling the finances, there could be personal liability exposure he's not aware of. What about my granddaughter's employment situation?" A pause. "She was employed by his cousin's practice for 2 years. Terminated the same day she was told to leave the family home. And the termination, was there any documentation? Any performance issues on record? None that she's aware of." Another pause. Longer. "Eleanor, you understand I'm not suggesting anything. Of course not," I said. "But if the timing of the termination correlates precisely with a family dispute, and if there's no documented performance basis for it, I understand. And the housing code violation is a separate matter, but unresolved violations can result in orders to vacate, fines, loss of rental license." "Yes. I'll need a few days," Diane said. "Take a week," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. Gerald called me on day 5. I had expected him to. Not because he was a humble man. He was not, but because I understood by then that he had learned about my granddaughter's whereabouts and had begun, in the way that controlling men do, to reassess the situation once he realized that the person his daughter-in-law had gone to was not a grieving grandmother sitting in a rocking chair somewhere, but a woman who was making phone calls. He did not know the specifics, but he knew something was in motion. You can always feel it when something is in motion, even if you can't see it yet. "Eleanor," he said, using my first name with the particular familiarity of a man who wants to establish that you are equals, or possibly that he is slightly more equal, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Tell me about the misunderstanding," I said pleasantly. He talked for several minutes. The words were an apology the way a glass of water is an ocean. Technically in the same category, but not remotely the same thing. He said he had been stressed. He said he cared deeply about his son's happiness. He said he hoped we could find a way to move forward as a family. I let him finish. "Gerald," I said, "I appreciate you calling. I do want to ask you one thing." "Of course. The property on Meridian Street, the heating system issue, has that been addressed?" Silence. "I ask because the tenant has been living with an unresolved code violation for over a year, and I would hate for something like that to become a larger issue for your business right when the family is working through a difficult time." More silence. The quality of it had changed entirely. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said carefully. "I think you probably are," I said, "but no matter. I'm sure it's something that can be sorted out quickly. Give my best to your wife." I hung up. Within 2 weeks, Gerald had filed paperwork to reinstate his dissolved LLC, retroactively with the help of a very expensive attorney, who I imagine charged him significantly for the privilege of explaining to him how badly he had exposed himself. The housing code violation on Meridian Street was resolved within 10 days. New heating system, proper inspection, all documentation filed. I know this because I checked. The dental practice, Gerald's cousin's practice, called my granddaughter and offered her position back. She declined politely, and 2 weeks after that, she accepted a position at a different practice across town, one that paid 30% more and had nothing to do with anyone named Gerald or related to anyone named Gerald. Diane sent a letter on my granddaughter's behalf regarding the circumstances of her termination. Nothing was filed. Nothing needed to be filed. The letter was enough. Because the letter made clear that we understood the timeline, and understanding the timeline was enough. My grandson came to my house on a Saturday morning. He sat across the kitchen table from me with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and he looked like a man who had been doing a lot of thinking and had not particularly enjoyed any of it. "I should have answered the phone," he said. "Yes," I said, "you should have. I didn't know he was going to do that." "Maybe not, but you knew what he was capable of. We don't get to unknow things, sweetheart." He was quiet for a while. He drank his coffee. Through the kitchen doorway, we could both hear Eli playing in the living room, making the sound effects for whatever small drama he was staging with his toy trucks. "I'm looking for another job," my grandson said, "not with his company." "Good," I said. "It won't be easy. I don't have. I mean, outside of what I've been doing for him, I don't have a lot on paper." I looked at him for a moment. He was 28 years old, and he had spent 2 years inside his father's small circle, doing work that kept him close and kept him just uncertain enough about his own abilities. I recognized that too. I had seen it happen to good people before. "I know some people," I said. "If you're willing to start from the middle and work your way up, I can make a call." He looked at me across the table, and I saw something shift in his face. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the particular mix of gratitude and embarrassment that comes with realizing someone has been quietly watching out for you while you weren't paying attention. "Grandma," he said, "what exactly do you do?" I smiled. "I used to run a company," I said. "Now I mostly drink tea and mind my grandchildren." He laughed a little helplessly. "You could have said something to me before all this." "You weren't ready to hear it," I said, "and it wasn't mine to say. A person has to find their own way to the door before you can hold it open for them." He nodded slowly. I could see him turning that over. "Is she gonna come back?" he asked. "To us. To me." "That's between you and her," I said. "But I will tell you this. The version of yourself that lets his father make decisions for his family, that version isn't someone she should come back to. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," he said quietly. "The version of yourself that picks up the phone," I said. "That version is worth working toward." My granddaughter stayed with me for 6 weeks. She found a small apartment on the other side of Columbus, a first-floor unit with a little fenced yard where Eli could run, and she put down the deposit with money I gave her and told her was a gift, not a loan. Because I had learned long ago that loans between family members had a way of becoming debts of a different kind. On the day she moved out, I helped her carry boxes and I put together a bookshelf in Eli's room, and I sat on the floor of her small living room eating takeout noodles while Eli ran back and forth across the empty space, because empty spaces are irresistible to 3-year-olds. "I keep thinking," she said, "that I should have seen it coming." "You saw enough," I said. "You got out." "I waited too long." "You waited until you could move," I said. "That's not the same as waiting too long. That's survival." She looked at me. "How do you know all this?" I twirled noodles on my fork. "I've been paying attention for 64 years. It adds up." She was quiet for a moment. Eli crashed into the wall at the far end of the room, bounced off it, and ran back toward us, completely unbothered. "I want to be like you when I'm older," she said. "Is that a weird thing to say?" "It's a very kind thing to say," I told her, "although I hope your path there is considerably less complicated than mine was." She laughed at that, genuinely, and it was the first time I had heard her laugh like that in 6 weeks, unclenched and real, and I thought that it was enough. Not everything, not the end of hard things, but enough for right now on the floor of a small apartment with takeout noodles and a toddler running laps, and a woman who had gone from a bench outside a hospital to a place with her name on the lease. Gerald, as far as I know, is still managing his properties on the east side. He reinstated his LLC. He resolved his violations. He has not, to my knowledge, called me again. He is not a changed man. Men like Gerald rarely change. But he is a more careful man now, which is its own kind of outcome. The thing about power is that the people who use it loudly, the ones who tell young women they have 2 hours, who fire people the same day they throw them out, who have built small kingdoms by making sure everyone inside them feels slightly afraid, those people are always surprised to discover that the world extends beyond their kingdom. That there are people outside the walls who have been quiet for reasons of their own and who've been watching and who, when the moment comes, know exactly what to do. I told my granddaughter that before she left. I told her that the moment she called me from that bench, or rather, the moment she got in the car and let herself be helped, was the moment the situation changed. Not because of anything I did, but because she stopped waiting for someone inside that circle to rescue her and accepted that the help she needed was always outside it. Remember that, I told her. When Eli grows up and something happens that you don't know how to handle, the answer is almost never inside the problem. You have to get yourself outside it first. She hugged me for a long time on the doorstep of her apartment, while Eli hugged my knees, which is the preferred hugging location of 3-year-olds. And then I walked to my car, and I drove home to my quiet house, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought that 64 years was a long time to learn things, and I was glad, for once, that I had paid attention. I thought about the woman on the bench, my granddaughter, yes, but also every woman who has ever sat on a bench outside a hospital or a grocery store or a bus station with one bag and a child and a phone that isn't ringing. I thought about what it would mean for one of them to have someone pull up to the curb and say, "Get in the car," and mean it, completely without conditions. I hoped she knew I meant it without conditions. I believe she did. And I thought, if you were listening to this and you were that woman on the bench right now with the bag and the silence and the hope that is starting to calcify into something harder, get in the car, whoever is offering, whatever direction it goes. You do not have to know exactly what to do. You just have to move.